is Tom Froggatt. I'm the CEO of Singular. We're a consulting company. We help biotech companies to build brilliant teams and create brilliant cultures. The reason for this event is that a couple of months ago, we did two things. We opened our offices in Boston and New York. And as part of that launch, we launched the US Gateway service, which is designed for biotech companies that are not in the US but want to enter that market, or perhaps have recently come onto American soil and are looking to expand. And there's obviously huge potential in the US market. There are a number of challenges that come along with opening a US business as well. And so what we're trying to do is make that transition much, much easier for biotech companies by, of course, helping them find the right people and attract the right talent, but also adapt to the US working culture, while also maintaining the essence of the culture that's made them successful so far, as well as navigating some of the logistical challenges. And I believe you've all been sent a copy of the US Gateway Guide.
Oui, mais ils font les autres trucs.
If you have got that, then please take a look if you haven't done already. There's a lot of really good information in there. We did an event around it as well. If you haven't got that, drop me a line afterwards. I'll get you a copy. Today, we thought we'd share some other expertise with you. And so I'm joined by Ashley Jones and Kenny Duncan, and I will ask the guys to introduce themselves in just a minute. Both have a unique perspective on US biotech, and we'll be able to share with you some of the things that they've found through their career that will be pertinent to anyone who's looking at establishing themselves in the US. So with that said, I will hand over we'll start with Kenny to just introduce yourself really briefly and tell everyone who you are and why you're here.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So my name is Kenny Duncan. I currently serve as SVP of Chemistry at Accent Therapeutics. My career has been in medicinal chemistry and biotech companies, starting in the UK and then moving to the US, and working in a number of small biotech companies in the US, including one company that was actually acquired by a UK biotech company. So seeing the integration from both sides there. So yeah, that's my background. Thanks for the invite.
No, great to have you, Kenny. And Ashley, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Jones. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Cultivate Co. I have spent majority of my career in what is called HR, culture, people, operations, in the biotech industry, both working at sort of mid-size pharma and then so Vertex Pharmaceuticals in that sort of mid bucket, if you will, these days, and experience kind of working with global populations in that size organization, as well as I then moved and worked through with several startups, building their functions from the ground up, kind of at the Series A stage, and then bringing through to the clinic.
Fantastic. So yes, the way that we want this panel to work, by the way, is that we want it to be as interactive as possible. I've prepared a whole bunch of questions that I will ask, but we want to answer your questions. So you'll see there's a Q&A box right at the top. If you can put any questions that you have in that Q&A box, then we will get to them as quickly as possible, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. I'm going to kick off with a couple just to give you guys a bit of time to think and write, because I know it takes a little bit of time to get them in the Q&A. But yeah, please do put your questions in there, and we will answer as many of them as we possibly can. To start with, I have a question that I'm going to direct at Kenny because he's experienced it firsthand. But actually, please feel free to jump in as well. I think, particularly for companies coming from the UK, there's often an assumption that the US is very similar culturally, and there are some similarities, obviously, but there's some pretty big differences too. And depending on where else in the world you're coming from, those differences may be even more pronounced. You've been in this side of the pond for a good few years now, Kenny.
Yep.
Tell us a bit about your observations on the cultural differences between US working culture, European working culture, and and I guess the things that sort of the things you expected and maybe some of the things you didn't expect.
Okay, then let me start. So I think when I was starting to move to the US, the thing that was, I think, the biggest worry for me, I think, was the number, the holidays, and the approach to work and work all the time. That was the approach and the thought and that everyone had.
Yeah.
And and it's still some of the culture from the US. Think, oh, it would be great, wouldn't it be great to be a European company and have all of these vacations?
Yes.
But I don't really, I understand, and I don't really notice it right now because you get so much more engaged. I feel so much more engaged with the teams I'm working with the people, with the shared vision, and there really is a drive to do what you need to do for patients, and that it's not a talking point. A lot of people and I've been fortunate enough to be in a lot of companies with really strong culture and a real strong drive to do this. And we remind ourselves every week that this is what we're doing. I didn't feel the same drive in the company I was in before, but it was a different kind of drive and it was a different atmosphere. Everyone worked together, everyone to really work hard. The focus was in a slightly different place. And that's not a criticism of either one. It just is. It's a slightly different cultural aspect of it, and it's an experience that I picked up on. And I honestly really enjoy. I've enjoyed both of them, but I really enjoy that kind of target going in this year, and that's just why I kind of thrive in this environment. Yeah.
So really focused on what's the outcome, what's the point of what we're doing.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
A huge part of it.
Yeah.
As a scientist.
Of course.
Yep.
And Ashley, you've obviously looked at it from the other side in terms of being here in the US and working for US companies, but I know you've been involved in international teams. Any observations on cultural differences at all?
Yeah, I think something I might say is the American, probably only, I don't know if I'm the only American on the call here, but I think that we all make, and this is something regardless of company and culture, we all make assumptions about people and what they're like and what culture they might like, what culture they're from and how they might communicate as a result of that. And I think just a piece of advice is that it isn't like Cambridge, Boston is a more international community, I think, than it used to be. And so you're dealing with, people across all different cultures. And also, I think that there's sometimes an assumption that Americans aren't direct and love chit chat. And I think that there is actually probably more of that than maybe folks often maybe give them. I don't know if credit's the right word there, but I think kind of keeping that in mind, that, to sort of not go in making assumptions about what the kind of talent market is going to be and who the people are going to be that you're bringing in.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think, biotech's always been an international playing field, right? But certainly, with the access that international students have to some of the top US universities, and then a lot of them stay on and find themselves in that ecosystem. You really do have people from all over the world. Walking through Cambridge this morning, the amount of languages I heard on the way over here is unbelievable. So yeah, it's a really good point. Your focus, of course, Ashley, has been partly on the HR side of things, and I think that's an important topic to address because there are nuances in things like employment law and HR standards and things like that in every country in the world, but the US is its own unique system, and of course every state is different, and there's all sorts of complexities. What I'm not so much thinking about international companies here, but it will apply to this. You've worked with a lot of small biotech companies and growing biotech companies. What have been the things that you've noticed from an HR perspective that maybe have caught them out, or maybe they've missed or misunderstood, the sort of nuances that you think it's important to be aware of from an HR perspective?
Yeah, do you, and from an like sort of employment law perspective or just across the board, Tom?
Could be, or could be just in terms of like best practice, or yeah, whatever you see tripping people up, I suppose.
Yeah. I think oftentimes, some of the things as companies are formed kind of quickly or with few employees, and maybe something that's not thought about is kind of like the baseline benefits and expectations for when you start to bring in, your sort of scientific or like junior to mid-level staff that maybe don't have like a support system of benefits outside of themselves personally and
Yes.
things like that. And so making sure that you've thought about making those competitive early on is, I think, important, because you can find yourselves in situations where you're trying to recruit someone and they're asking you all these questions about their benefits because they hold all benefits for their entire family. And it turns out that they're very, very different than maybe what they're used to. And so just keeping in mind that there is a baseline expectation for a strong, like in Massachusetts, it's Blue Cross Blue Shield is like what everyone wants to have. They want to have an option for a PPO and an HMO, and they expect, dental and vision to be included in that. And sometimes that those are covered, 100%. That if there's a high deductible plan, which these are like, there's all these different types of plans here in the US. And there's a leaning towards a high deductible plan, which is lower premiums for employees, but you provide them actually money towards their healthcare deductible. And so there is sort of this, like, once you have an entity here, or if you're looking to bring people onto the team, it's something that can become important and a sticking point. You might have someone who's flexible for a period of time, but most early companies I go into, kind of the first things I'm fixing are benefits and also usually compensation structures, because they're typically kind of put together based on who you're hiring. And then once you start kind of looking at the team, you start seeing that there's discrepancies because it's been a little bit less thoughtful, for lack of a better word.
Yes. And I think, it's easy to underestimate how important those things are in American life, right? Because, that health insurance is so critical to just people's life and well-being, and perhaps more so in other parts of the world. We've had our first question come through from Sarah. And I guess this is probably one that either of you could talk to, but it might be one for you, Ashley. Sarah was wondering, is there any place that someone can go, particularly employees, but I suppose employers as well, to help them get set up more quickly if they're an expat arriving in the US? So sort of information about where do you go and set up a bank account? How do you get a social security number? How does the healthcare system work? Like that kind of thing. Is there any resources you're aware of around that kind of thing?
That's a great question. I'm not, Kenny can maybe answer that question for you. I know that as like an HR person at a company, if we're bringing someone over on a visa and things like that, we usually we try and kind of help hold that person's hand and support them through the process. But I can't, maybe Kenny can provide some more.
Oh, you're on mute, Kenny.
Sorry about that. When my wife and I came over to the US, at first, it was her company that brought us to the US, and they had done this a few times before. It was an intercompany transfers, and they had everything kind of sorted out: visas in the UK, coaching on different cultural differences. So we did a training program on living in the US and working in the US as well. But when we came to the US, we had, prior to our visit, a trip. I think it was a consultant. She was a realtor by training, but she also helped us with lots of other things. So she would help you find rental places. She would help you say, this is where you go for your social security number. This is where you go for to set up your nearest bank, and there was one right next to the social security place, and depending on which town you were in. So she had really great knowledge, and she even helped me through passing the driving test over here, because you had to get a driving license as well, which was kind of strange, because the guy, the instructor, the state policeman thought it was my mom, but so if you can find a service like that, and I can try and find some information on that. There's a couple of people who will do that kind of consultancy and work with companies, larger multinational companies that can do that. And it's a really great resource if you can find that. I can try and find some information and share it with the group later on.
Yeah, and actually, when Sarah, when I moved to New York, we had a very similar thing. So these are kind of independent consultants. As Kenny said, this was someone who was trained as a realtor. I'm pretty sure the woman who did it for me was just a student who was in New York and was doing this in her spare time. But she took me to get a mobile phone. She took me to sort of see apartments and to sort of understand where things were and what neighborhoods were and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it can be relatively inexpensive actually, because they're sort of part-time consultants, and they'll give you a sort of hourly rate for doing it. So that can be quite useful. I had a question from Magali. Magali, if I bring you up, could I get a bit more context on your question? Is that okay? Just to make sure we're answering it correctly.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just would like to have more details, and I'm sure you have experience of people moving from Europe, UK, or Europe to the US in US companies. And for Europeans, it's a bit difficult to check on all the things you need to think of, health insurance and other aspects. So right now, what are proposing US companies when they want to bring, I don't know, a talent or someone from Europe to the US? What kind of contracts would they propose? Are there standardized aspects that you are aware of? What is your experience in this field?
So I can think I'll try and answer the question. I think in the past, when I've been at larger organizations, typically doing something like this versus sort of a smaller startup, but typically there'd be some level of support on from a tax perspective, and kind of we would assign, give someone and pay for mainly kind of tax advice and guidance on how to manage kind of both being employed and working in the US and being an expat, because a company itself shouldn't be giving you that tax advice. We should be, so instead we partner with a company to provide employees with that guidance. And I think that's something that I would recommend organizations do if they're going to bring someone in. So typically there's part of the agreement, if you will, that you're coming for a placement, is that the company is going to provide you a couple different types of support in order to help you manage all those logistics. Did that answer the question, Magali?
Yes, absolutely. So these are lawyers within the company?
No, it would be an external party that the company would, pay an invoice. They would contract for that service. Say, we will pay you to provide this type of advice to Magali.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Thanks, Magali.
I was going to say, again, I've got experience in that. We had a company, they had paid for an accountancy firm to have an accountant that we'd work with for tax advice and helping you fill in tax forms and the residency issues between both countries, so you qualified for the right one.
I think it's an important point. I know when I came over from the UK, so I had always been on what we call PAYE in the UK, which is just, the your employer just takes the tax out of your paycheck at the end of the month and pays it to the government for you. Um, in the US, that happens, but you still have to fill in a tax return and you still have to do all that kind of stuff yourself. And there are services that can do it for you, but it can be quite complicated if you try and do it yourself. So I think depending on what country people are coming from and therefore what they're used to, I think kind of awareness around that is really important because there can be some quite big penalties for not filling in your tax return properly.
Yeah, and I think just something I don't have experience in, but just in talking with employees, like I someone who is planning to go back to France and that's what where they're going to retire. That's been something that they've really had to think through from kind of like a financial retirement and savings and where they contribute. And so using just there's longer term things to think about when you come to the US, but then if you're planning to go back to your, home country, external advice is probably advisable there.
Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer the question, Magali? Was that what you're after?
Yeah. It's very clear, and I think there are many things we need to think of for foreign people moving to the US. So yes, and we need help anyway because it's it's you need expertise, and usually people don't have this expertise for sure.
Yeah, well, look, one of the things that we've put together as part of this US Gateway offering is a network of partners that can help with this sort of stuff. So, obviously we're not tax advisors, but we have some partnerships with people who are experienced in expat transitions and things like that. So, if that sort of contact would be useful for you, then please do let me know.
Thank you
very much. There's a point here that's been made in the chat. Thank you, Mike, for adding this because I think that's important. To open a US bank account, you need a US address and a social security number. Address is easy. Social security number, you need someone to employ you. The other thing I'd say is actually this is worth knowing. When if you move to the US as a foreign national, you have zero credit. It doesn't matter how much credit that you had anywhere else. Doesn't matter if you're very wealthy. None of that matters. You have no credit. You can't get a credit card. You can't get any of that stuff. Unless the way around it that I found was that I had happened to, only by luck, I was with HSBC as my personal bank. And so they obviously had a presence in the US as well. I was able to actually transfer the credit that I had because I was using the same bank. Now, I don't know if that's possible with every bank, but basically they gave me credit. They almost gave me internal credit to their bank rather than external credit. So I was able to get a credit card and things like that through them because I'd been with them for a number of years. But that's something that's worth being aware of. When my mum and dad moved to the US, they went and they weren't able to buy furniture or anything like that because you have to buy on credit. And they didn't have any credit. And my mum's boss actually had to come and buy the furniture for them, and they had to pay her back. So that's something that's worth being aware of from a financial point of view. Looping back to something, Ashley, that you talked about, healthcare is such a big topic for employees. It's a real differentiator to when you're hiring people. The people with the best healthcare plans often attract better candidates because it is such a central issue for US employees, and the range of it can vary, right? You can get very, very basic healthcare plans, and you can get bells and whistles healthcare plans that some of which have a lot to them, some of which are just expensive without many features. Any advice around healthcare and sort of what people should look out for if they're not familiar with the system and what they should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the baseline is medical, dental, vision, long-term disability, short-term disability, and AD&D, which is accidental death and life insurance. Mm-hmm. Those are the ones that everyone expects that you will have. And then for long-term disability, short-term disability, and AD&D, the expectation is you'll be paying for, the employee is not paying for any of those. The other elements of, I would say, benefits that are particularly important to folks are actually kind of commute is really important here, and I'm sure it's important everywhere, but traffic and parking in Boston, Cambridge is at a premium. And so parking, there's an expectation that parking is typically covered, close to full, so that's an expense that folks would be expecting, and that's depending on where you are, anywhere from $350 to $475 a month,
Wow.
which is, I know, sounds so crazy because it is, but that is something and that's why people care about it, because when you add that up, it's a fair amount of dollars. And there's other kind of benefits that are what I call fringe. I would focus on the core, the parking, the medical, dental, vision. And the fluff, I think, gets less recognition from folks. There might be a few people here and there that really capitalize on it. But if you have that core and the commuter benefits, that's what's most important.
Yeah. Okay. Anything you'd add on that, Kenny?
No, I think those core aspects that Ashley highlighted are absolutely crucial. They've definitely made the ability to work much, much easier. And as for the as much help as you can get to explain the health insurance options and what it means, is something who came from the UK, who they had the NHS and didn't have a clue, and honestly still struggles sometimes. But it's really crucial to have that get that core set up.
And to get that, I think using an insurance broker and get a recommendation for one that there's varying degrees of competence there and engagement, and some are very willing to really kind of be available to your employees, whereas others are not. And so finding the right one is important.
Ashley, would you say that the other employee assistance program things that come along that are potentially part of the other things outside the core, do those usually come, in your experience, with the same insurance brokers?
They do. Like if you're going to get short-term disability or long-term disability, that EAP, Employee Assistance Program, is usually through one of those providers, and it comes as a bundle. So
yeah, okay. No, that's helpful. Just on, you mentioned, the sort of commuter element to that and how difficult parking can be in Boston. And I think, some of this depends on where you're going, right? Because parking is really difficult in Boston. In New York, everyone gets the subway. If you're in Austin, Texas, then there's probably a big car park in your building. There's kind of differences in that. And I think this is probably a point that's worth talking about, is where people might want to consider. Because, I think for European companies, particularly Boston is often the obvious choice because it's relatively close. The time difference isn't too bad. It's kind of known as the biotech hub. You guys are both based in Boston. Positives, challenges. What are your views on sort of the Boston ecosystem as a place to kind of enter the US as a biotech company?
I'll jump in at least from an employee perspective. It's exciting because there's so many opportunities. There's so many other companies here, so you get an opportunity to talk to people and get lots of other experience and learn from the broader community. And there's always plenty of opportunities to network. At the same time, it's kind of daunting. Because it's such a big, well-established network, it's difficult to get started. So as an employee coming there, it's a little challenging to get started, but there's so many things available. I don't know personally what it's like in another part of the country that doesn't have that established network that you can tap into. But I think it would be probably easier to reach out and make those connections and be easier to find space, perhaps. and get set up with. There's always lots of advantages and tax advantages for everyone's trying to set up lots of little biotech hubs, and there's a lot more investment in a number of different cities around the country to do that. And so I think it's starting to get a little bit more competitive, and I think it's great.
Yeah, I think I would just echo there's, an ecosystem here in the area that is great and easy to, I think, to tap into. And so like Boston, Cambridge is one area, and I think there's people that really enjoy and want to take the time to come into that area because their colleagues from former companies are there, and you walk around and like you're waving to people that you used to work with, 3 years ago or catching up. And so there's this kind of idea of like even if you've moved on to another company, you're contributing to this like greater ecosystem of saving, being able to save patients. There's also, I think, the concept too of looking just outside. And I think that's just sort of where you have to think about if you're bringing people kind of over here to the US, you might want to think about like what their lifestyle is and where, what locations you might want to choose, because a place like Waltham is maybe a lot more attractive to a certain demographic than a place like Cambridge. And, it might be worth just talking to someone to get to know honestly, the traffic patterns of the greater Boston area, because you might think on a map that looks close, but you'll talk to someone like, I live in Boston and I would never go to Waltham. So that's, right. But it's, really technically it's close, but it would take me an hour to get there. So those are just things to think about when you're thinking about location in the area.
I was late to a meeting this morning before this session that was 2 miles away from where I was, and it took me 35 minutes to get there. So I got first-hand experience of that earlier. And I think, but I'm sure most people on this call have been and spent some time in Boston and Cambridge. That everyone, I think, is in the industry. If you haven't, biotech really does dominate the landscape here, and even just walking around the place, like I say, I got a cab to a meeting earlier, and I went past Lilly's huge building on the water, and there was a big Vertex building. Novartis have a campus that goes across both sides of the street in Cambridge, and you have Takeda, and almost every business that you look at, especially in Cambridge, is a biotech company. And I think there are positives to that from a talent perspective, in that there is a lot of talent here, but there's also a lot of competition for that talent, and so that's worth considering if you're in a field, for example, where it's very new and it's very sort of exploratory, and there are other companies here that are doing the same thing as you, then that might be something that you want to consider. If you're in something that's a bit more established, you may be able to attract talent out of the main hubs into other locations that are more cost effective, because it is an expensive place to be. But there is a reason for that premium, and there's a reason why, even despite that cost, more and more companies keep coming to Boston. Stephen, thank you for the question. Are US candidates attracted to roles for the same reasons as candidates in Europe? Or do you feel you have to appeal to them in a different way? I guess, and Ashley, that might be a difficult question for you to answer, but I guess the question comes down to, when you're recruiting, what do you think employees in the US really care about? What are the things that actually attract them to companies, to roles? What are the things that should be emphasized?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a desire for transparency, I think, is important, and an expectation that employees have here. I can't speak to whether or not that's different in the UK, but I would say transparency is an expectation. And on that front, I think, this has always been part of the conversation, but in particular, I think right now, because it is, it's a competitive market, there's this is a difficult time financially in the marketplace for our industry. And so I think people understanding, you may get a lot of questions on kind of like runway and understanding of kind of milestones and things that are going to be impacting that. And so for employed candidates particularly, and not that unemployed people can't be picky, but that's something to keep in mind, that's, I think, an area that people are focusing more on these days than they had in the past when kind of money was flowing plentiful. And I can talk more about expectations, but I want to give Kenny a chance to share his perspective too.
You hit the nail on the head there, Ashley, about a lot of it. I mean, it's, yeah, there is a, trying to remember. I actually had one just before I can finish that. I actually had one question I wanted to ask Stephen, and it was really just, what do you think the European and UK candidates are really looking for? And that might help us try and frame that there a little bit and help with some of the contrasts.
While Stephen, I'm sure, frantically types, I can probably speak to that a little bit because we do a fair amount of research on it. So number one driver in every time we look at this is career progression. Specifically actually within that, it's often not that people don't have opportunity in their current role, but it's that perhaps that opportunity isn't like, it's not clear to them what the next step is or how to progress or what they need to do in order to take that next step. And then someone offers them an opportunity to progress. And that's the number one driver. I think in the scientific community, opportunities to learn, obviously those two things are related to each other. But you see that in the sense of sort of someone might have worked on a particular type of science for 5 or 6 years and they want to do something different, or they might want to learn how to be a project manager, or they might want to learn how to manage people and that kind of thing, learn new skills as well as progress their career. And I think over the last 18 months, there's been a lot more emphasis on security, safety, stability, leadership. The company's actually run by people who know what they're doing. And I think that's a result of people kind of having been burnt by leadership teams who didn't necessarily have the experience to navigate difficult times. So, I mean, those are the things we've typically seen in the market. Stephen, feel free to pop in the chat if there's anything I've missed there.
I am muted. Can I just speak it out because my typing's really slow?
Yeah, go on.
Well, the only other thing that I was thinking of is that there's a real sense with the candidates in this market, I think, that people are looking for something or looking for a way to contribute to something really meaningful, something bigger than themselves. They really want to feel like they're delivering or contributing to something that's going to have real impact. And I guess maybe the root of the question was whether there's maybe a more, maybe I've got a more favourable look of the UK and European market, and maybe I'm being kind to candidates in the UK and Europe, but I get the sense that maybe there's more of a transactional approach to finding work in the States that maybe naively I'm thinking is less the case in the UK and Europe. People are more interested in the rewards and the compensations maybe in the US than they are in Europe.
That's a that's a good point. So I think I think that gets a little bit to some of the stereotypes and really just the shape and structure of packages, of compensation packages in the US. Yes, there is an emphasis on making sure you have title, right? So title is important. Your job description is really, really important, and what you're actually going to be doing within that title range. Having a competitive, and especially in this Boston area, keeping a competitive salary in that range with bonus and any kind of stock options or grants that are available. Those are all pretty key, and they're at the top of the conversation. And people are much more willing to ask those questions in the US than I think than they would be in Europe, perhaps. And that's why I think it comes across as being more transactional. But I really would, in my experiences for the people that I've hired in their broader organization, people still have that real focus and drive to have the larger meaning. And that's what I said really early on. That is there, but there are things to get out of the way first. And we want to make sure we start, let's get the difficult conversations out of the way, get them open and have that conversation and say, okay, we all happy here? And as long as the negotiation's done, and don't be afraid to ask, where should I be? And can I get more? Or is this negotiable? What parts are negotiable? It seems like a transaction, but it's just sensible business to get you started, because once that's out of the way, then the real hard work can happen and you can really contribute, and you can feel that you really contribute and being rewarded for that contribution.
I think to add Kenny, what Kenny said, I think is very good representation of it, because people are looking for that meaningful work, or looking to try or do new science. But because there's so many companies here and job opportunities, they're sort of saying, okay, let's get this sort of like the comp is sort of almost like, let's make sure that that's not in the way of me thinking about, how big of a change would this be to my lifestyle and my family to do this really cool thing. And so it is sort of just figuring out, okay, now let's dive in about this exciting work, because I also think that you can't, there are people you could maybe attract away for a ton of money, but you can't just throw money at people to get them to come. They still want to see that the science is going to be doing something meaningful and impactful. And even kind of in a time when the market was crazy, there was people were throwing signing bonuses on to trying to attract talent because their companies didn't have the other aspects, right? They were missing the other things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I was just going to add to that. I know that that's definitely true. When we are doing our hiring process, particularly for the company that I've been in and the last couple of companies we've been in, where we've had the right culture and we've tried to make sure we hire the right people that are going to be the right fit. Ultimately, the final decision isn't necessarily on compensation from an internal point of view or from an external point of view. And I know people who have taken compromises in their package because they felt the team was awesome and they felt a real drive and a real joint kind of spirit towards this is where we want to go, and we want to get here as quickly and as efficiently and as effectively and as they possibly can. And we're all kind of built in and bought in on the task and on the mission for the company. And you get that from a good interview process with everybody there. And so that really adds to that. And so I think once, as I said before, and Ashley repeated, it's transactional at the start, but the real driver for people to make a decision on a job or a decision on a company to work with is that broader fit once you've had that good interviewing process.
Yeah, and by the way, Hannah, Magali, Emma, I've seen your questions. I will come to them in just a second. I think there's an important point here, though, is that, and I've seen this in searches that I've run for European companies in particular, hiring into the US, usually for the first time. Candidates expect that there will be a negotiation and that things are negotiable and that they are, it's not a negative thing to ask for flexibility, to ask, is this part of it? Can we talk about the salary? Can we talk about they will often push back on things. And that's common practice here. And I know that, a couple of companies I've worked with have been kind of surprised by that because it's less common practice in some European countries, whereas that's seen as sort of like not the proper thing to do unless an offer is way off the mark. I think it's more accepted here that you will ask those questions and see if you can squeeze a little bit extra out of the package, then why would you not? So I guess the point I would make is just don't be surprised if people come back to you and try and negotiate on things. It doesn't mean they're not interested. It's just that's the sort of common way things are done. So Hannah, you were the first one to get your question in, so I'll come to you first. When getting the best talent in the US, do companies manage to recruit directly, or is it standard practice to use a recruiter? I have an opinion on this, but I'm going to keep it to myself. I'll let you guys answer because I don't think it's fair that I answer that one.
Yeah, so I think I would say for VP and above, there is a tendency to use an agency, and more likely or not, that's what most companies are going to do for just the kind of attention paid to the search, and also that's like how people at that level expect to come across positions too. There's just sort of this like understood way of working that an executive search firm is going to be utilized for many of these positions. It's not to say that they don't happen through networks as well, but even in that case, typically that person will still go through the filter of the executive search firm. So I'd say, 80% of the time, that's companies are going to use an executive search firm for those level roles. And then really, Hannah, I think it depends. The answer to your question kind of just depends on like size and resources, as well as how difficult that role is going to be to fill. So I'll just, put my hat on, Tom, just to say how I typically kind of think about this as an HR professional. So if I know that I'm able to have the resources to have a recruiter kind of focused on that search, or a handful of searches, that will likely be a more cost-effective way for me to engage and hire, 5 people than it would for me to work directly with an agency to fill those 5 roles. At the same time, you don't always have the ability to do that. So you kind of have to think about, okay, where do I have my resources? A staffing firm, might be the best fit for that, or an agency. Or if you know from the market that, for example, like there's a period of time where biostatisticians super hard to find. I'm gonna use an agency for that because if I don't, it's going to take forever for us to find someone. So you're going to use a specialized agency, that does that. So I'll stop there. But that's how it can be looked at.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Hannah, obviously the fees can be quite significant because the salaries are typically higher, right? So if there is a situation where you're concerned from a cost point of view about wanting to try and do it directly, first of all, I genuinely mean this. I can happily give you some pointers on what you can do to be effective in doing that yourself, if that would be useful. So drop me a line afterwards and I can sort of run you through kind of some things you can do that might be helpful. But yeah, it is time consuming, and of course the time difference doesn't help, but the fees can be significant. So, like I understand why you might want to give it a go yourself first. Magali, this is a question I don't know the answer to, but hopefully one of you guys will. So Magali has asked about EB5 investment projects. So the EB5 investor visas, I believe, is what she's referring to. So there's a visa scheme for people who are willing to make a significant investment. I think it might be $1 million. It might be a little bit less than that into US businesses, and that being an opportunity for a visa. Is that what you're referring to, Maggie?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And I don't have a lot of insight on that. I kind of know what it is, but I haven't done much work with it. But Ashley, Kenny, any knowledge of that at all?
Me personally, typically we're working as employers with like O1s or H1Bs, or kind of those OPT, those types of visas, green cards. I haven't honestly run into EB5 in an employment situation.
I might know someone who I can connect you with, Magali. There's a law firm in London called Wilson Sonsini who do a lot of work with companies going to the US for investment purposes. They're an American firm, but they have an office in London that works with European companies. I will ask them. let me make a note of that. I will ask them if they can help with that, and I'll put you in touch if so.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And then I believe Emma had a question as well. Yeah, okay. So Emma's asked about equity as part of compensation packages, and that seems to be a common theme across actually almost all levels of hiring, not just at very senior levels. I think in Europe, what we typically see is that there are some startup companies who give equity to everyone. It's not sort of standard practice, but some do it, and certainly it tends to ratchet up for the executive hires and not be as prevalent for the more junior hires. But any sort of commentary on common practice from an equity point of view?
I'd say it is fairly common practice for everyone in the organization to receive some form of equity, regardless of level at the companies here in the US. I think there's varying degrees of, I think, also understanding and value of that is something that I would add. Yeah. But that it's typically part of every offer.
I would agree. I was actually really fortunate in the company I started working with in the UK. The CEO was an executive from a US pharma company who came over to start that organization, and part of that package was some equity in that company. I had no idea, and we didn't really get much of an education on what it actually meant.
This is what I mean.
Exactly. And then when it came to the US, it's still. I think some of the key questions that a lot of employees are going to ask are really, what does it mean? What are the effects? And I'm going back to my experience of being in a US company when it was bought by a UK company. We had equity in that organization, and when we were purchased, I think it would have been, in hindsight, slightly better, really good idea to have more oversight and more forethought on the tax implications of that kind of acquisition and what happens to the US employees, because in the UK it was treated one way, but in the US there was lots of tax implications for parts of the transaction, and so there was some help that the HR team in the UK did a great job of trying to help everybody through that. But there are tax implications depending on types of transactions you're going to do. So yeah, and it was really complicated. So try and help people towards a tax advisor is useful there as well.
And just to add, in terms of type of equity for like smaller companies, non-public, it's usually all options. And then if you're a public company, typically there's either options and restricted shares, and it kind of depends on level in which those are provided, restricted shares versus options.
Yeah. So that's the case for big companies as well, that everyone tends to have an equity package. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
I think there's been, just to comment on that, Tom, there's been, I think over the years, just having been to some Radford conferences, a lot of conversation about this at bigger companies, and I can't speak to it 100%, but discussions about kind of pulling back on sort of the more junior level employees for that equity, because it's not considered as valuable from their perspective. And, when you start thinking about like dilution and shareholder, like that's a place for a company to make up on that and then offer it later. But I can't say for sure, how many companies have implemented that approach, but that's been a discussion that I've heard over, several years.
Yeah. There's only so many times you can slice it up, right? Yeah. Okay. Question that I had, it kind of related to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the expectation of transparency, in terms of runway and things like that. Obviously, if you're an international company entering the US market, you're not going to have a lot of brand recognition. You're not going to have much of a reputation. are there ways that that you think companies can mitigate that, given that it's such a competitive field for talent? And any recommendations you'd make around that? If it's something that candidates are likely to be concerned about, right? Is like, who is this company? Are they going to be around next year?
This is advice I'd give to any company.
Yeah.
But I would think really first and foremost about that candidate experience and the first interactions that you have with them. Because if you're a new company, they don't know much about you. Their assessment is going to be on kind of how well you communicate, how organized kind of that recruitment process is, what you share about the company. And so if that is not kind of, doesn't have to be best practice, but if it isn't in great shape, you're going to be less likely to hold the attention of maybe someone that is a high po or top talent, because they don't know you, and you might come across as an organization that doesn't have, isn't well organized, or isn't caring about the individuals that they're bringing into the team. So that's a way I think that's an important thing if you have low brand recognition, to think about that.
I would definitely agree with that. I think, especially for more senior positions, being more open to share the vision of the organization and what you actually want that person to do in the organization. If you need to go through a CDA process to actually share some of that information, that can be really helpful, particularly for a senior hire. That can be really helpful, and if you really want to give people more information on what your longer term plans are, then that can help.
Yeah, I think
it shows intent and seriousness as well, from both sides. Yeah.
And you'd assume that if a company's entering the US market in any serious way, there's been a level of success that they've had, right, elsewhere. And so, I think leveraging that, showing that, being able to show, look, these are the people who are on our board, and these are our investors, and this is where we've got to here, and that kind of stuff. But like you say, you might have to lift the curtain, pull the curtain back a little bit, and lift the hood and let them have a look underneath. And that's fairly common, right? I think, as much as CDAs are worth less than the paper they're written on, in reality, there's a level of comfort and expectation that people have around putting them in place and being transparent. Again, we come back to that word, right?
Yeah, and there's, a period you can wait to get to that point too, for the sort of more stealth organizations I've worked for. We've, had 1 to 2 rounds and then said, okay, we're going to share the science with you now, because this is we're committed, and we feel like you're committed. So people understand that you might not get to that in the first conversation.
Yeah. To be clear, I don't think I've had anyone trying to offer a CDA just at the start of a company. Here we want to tell you everything. No, that's not a good person. It is later on.
But I think, to your point earlier, Kenny, people want to get excited about the science, right?
Yeah,
they want to get excited about the project, and so therefore you've got to give them the information they need to get excited.
Exactly. They want to know what the impact they can make is going to be, and that's really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I've got one more question, and please, people, feel free to put other questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We've mostly been using the chat. That's absolutely fine. But if there aren't any other questions, I'll ask this one last question and then we'll wrap up. But please, there's time for more if you do have more. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but any biotech company has multinational teams, right? And teams of people from different backgrounds, and it doesn't really matter if it's a US business full of people based in the US, or if it's a company coming from Israel or South Korea or wherever it might be coming from. There's going to be lots of different backgrounds and nationalities and beliefs and perspectives to manage and to collaborate. And that's, I guess, one of the beauties of it, right? And that's where innovation happens, and that's where the real secret sauce is. you've both been involved in running teams. You've both sort of had those situations to manage. Any general observations or advice you have around how you bring people who are very, very different in their backgrounds together to be effective?
Great question. Again, it goes back to the goal, setting the goal and making sure that the team is open, you've got communication, and you're really encouraging people to not just be within your team to communicate within your team, but you encourage them to be part of the broader family of the organizations, particularly if it's particularly useful for a smaller company. That's really crucial, no matter what your background, and you can get a chance to share that information and learn more about someone else's background. And you bond an awful lot faster if you keep that communication and keep it lighthearted, and keep it going. Various other organizations have taken times where, it's particularly in COVID, where you would give, we had one of our employees would run set questions. So at lunchtime, you'd go through and say, here, this is my background, these are my favorite music, this is my favorite music.
Okay.
And it's a great way to introduce people, because we hired a lot of people over the pandemic period and everyone was at home. So it was difficult to do it virtually. And I think that kind of soft ice breaking type of thing really helps you get to know, it sparks conversations. And that's, it's just, knowing that you're going to be in this together. That's my point of view. That really helps.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's great advice, Kenny. The knowing people beyond their job and their work is, really critical to fostering strong relationships and, ways that you can do that as an organization. And that's, a great example. And I've kind of done that in the past when you're bringing new people into the organization, kind of giving them an opportunity to share about themselves personally. And then also, I think what helps is when you have leaders role model that behavior, or you as a leader, you role model that. And the other piece is, actually kind of talking about how communication preferences and styles and getting together and understanding those different ways of working. And I think that just that in itself, like having an exercise or a conversation as a team as to where you've come from like an organization, and also sort of how you are as a human being. People bring good and bad baggage from other companies. And I think that it can be a good place to sort of bring that out and kind of say, oh, that's actually something that we don't have as part of our culture here. Like, we like to really iterate and experiment on things, versus some organizations, you don't bring anything to the table until it's pretty much fully baked and done. And so spending time on that sort of like onboarding, so to speak, is, I think, really critical to sort of getting people to work well together.
Yeah, no, both really good points. And I think, that onboarding period, both socially and in terms of just teaching people how to do their job and setting expectations, is often neglected because of the pace of everything that's going on. But it's such a critical time. But I'd encourage any company to be more thoughtful and more deliberate about it when they're bringing people in. No, it seems like a pain and seems laborious, but it's so critical.
You can fit that into your 90-day onboard experience.
Yeah.
It pays off. It really does.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is all the questions. So, Ashley, Kenny, thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you both, as always. And I think, we've had some comments already that it's been really helpful, really interesting. So thank you very much for joining us. If anyone has any further questions about any of the things we've talked about, or about sort of US expansion or landing in the US in general, get in touch with me. I'm on tom@singular-biotech.com. And yeah, happy to talk you through it. Happy to talk to you about what your plans are and how we might be able to help and advise you and connect you with people who can point you in the right direction. So Ashley, Kenny, thank you once again. Thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.